Now, I am a 90s kid. I was born in 97, so I'm in the middle where I remember using VCRs and dial-up internet, but I wasn't 90s enough to have those giant brick-looking phones and ugly haircuts. Now, a lot of happened in the 90s. Friends aired for the first time, the Soviet Union collapsed, and a lot of people had bad things happen to them, the perpetrators of which have remained unpunished. Well, some of them. What is up, you guys? Hope you are having an awesome day. I'm your host, Eamon Hassan, and welcome back to another video. And today we are dissecting the 90s, and not in a cute BuzzFeed quiz kind of way where we find out how much of a 90s kid you really are. No, we are going dark. These are the top 10 true scary stories from the 90s. And you know, it's just that much more frightening when they're true stories, you feel me. Starting us off at number 10 is The Patient. Now, I hate any mental institution story because I know for a fact in the 80s and 90s, horrible things happened in those places and those people were treated like animals. This story was shared by an anonymous person who said their grandma used to work at one of these facilities, but this one was where prisoners were sent who were too mentally unstable to be in actual prison. Now, one of the patients was put there because he had killed his parents and hid their bodies under the floorboards of his house. Every other day, he would bring his mother's body out and do explicit things to it. Necrophiliac, let's just leave it at that. He was caught after his neighbors started complaining about the stench, which was obviously the rotting bodies. Either way, this patient was super fond of the grandma, and she happened to live walking distance from the facility. Either way, some patients who were well enough were allowed to walk around the area, and one day she woke up in the middle of the night to intense banging at her door. The patient had escaped and begged her to come inside. Safe to say, he was caught ASAP, and the grandma moved house ASAP as well. Coming in at number 9 is Chad MAURER. Back in May of 1990, 19-year-old Chad was on his way back to work after picking up some sandwiches from his house. An hour later, his parents ended up going to his hardware store to get some things, but Chad's car was nowhere to be found. The other employees hadn't seen him either, and he never ended up coming home that night. 2 days later, his parents reported him missing, and 3 days after that, his body was found 150 miles away. He had died from carbon monoxide poisoning in his car in a new unlocked garage. Now, the police initially thought it was a suicide, but when his body was examined, his parents could see bruises on his face and body, and his knuckles had been skinned. He had clearly fought with someone. The shirt he was wearing had blood on it, and after looking at the crime scene photos, his parents noticed a jacket on the passenger seat that they knew did not belong to him. When the county sheriff asked for the jacket, Chicago PD told them it had gone missing. Autopsy results also showed the level of carbon monoxide in his body was 74%. Now, if he had died because of it, the level should have been around 50 to 60%, meaning he was already unconscious when he started inhaling it. Hence, someone had killed or thoroughly beat him before planting him at the scene. 3 people ended up getting arrested for his death on the basis of moving from Chicago to Madison very close to the time of his death. Nothing was ever proven though, so we don't know who killed Chad MAURER. At number 8, we have the string of homicides. 58-year-old Clark Perry Baldwin was the perpetrator behind a string of countless murders in the early 1990s. In 1991, he was arrested for raping a hitchhiker he had picked up. He had even tried choking her to death too, but she had managed to escape. That same year, he killed Pamela Rose McCall and her unborn child, and in 1992, he was charged with killing 2 women known as Bitter Creek Betty and I-90 Jane Doe. Betty was found frozen naked and left with just her wedding ring, whereas I-90 Jane Doe had been strangled and hit in the head with something, and her body was found mummified. Brutal. Thankfully, DNA recovered from the McCall case got a match last year and was matched with the suspect of 2 other unsolved homicides. It ended up matching Baldwin, and the sick bastard was finally arrested. Yes! Justice! We love a bit of justice. Filling on number 7 slot is The Kidnapping. This one was shared by a now deleted Reddit user who used to work at a pretty famous record shop in LA in the 90s. There was one customer in his 20s that used to come in quite regularly and spoke to the user quite a bit. Now, one day while talking, he mentioned how her dad wasn't American, a detail she had never told him herself. Concerned but not too concerned, she just assumed one of her co-workers had told him. The next week, as she was driving home from work, work, her car ended up breaking down. It was miles to the nearest payphone, but she managed to get there and call a cab. She sat in front of the payphone and waited for a few minutes before it randomly started ringing. Doubtful, she answered it to some guy saying, "Bad luck about your car, talk to me until your ride gets there." Now, she hung up automatically when she realized the voice on the phone belonged to that same customer. He had followed her and trailed her car and called her from somewhere nearby. Within 48 hours, she had quit her job and moved back home with her parents, and found out months later that same customer was arrested for kidnapping. She was this close to becoming his kidnappee. Now at number 6 is Isaac Gerwig. On the 2nd of April 1995, 18-year-old Isaac Gerwig was found dead in the water of this canal in ULBRICH, Netherlands. Autopsy results showed he had been hit in the head with a blunt object and died of those injuries before being thrown in the water days later. But the Wednesday before his death, Isaac spent time at home celebrating his sister's birthday before walking over to his girlfriend's house. But that was a trip he never came back from. Now, to give some background, the boy was unemployed, but he was a sound guy. He didn't do drugs, he didn't drink, he wanted to join the army, and his girlfriend claimed they were about to get engaged. Upon further investigation, the team then started guessing he'd been mistaken for someone else and then killed because of it. The case gave up no clues, no leads, and most importantly, no suspects. Coming in at number 5 is the baby. Back in May of 1990, 2-month-old Harpreet Paul was left in the backseat of her parents' car near the Coquitlam Centre Mall. The parents left it unlocked, and when they came back 30 minutes later, the baby and car seat had vanished. Now, before going further into the case, why on earth would the parents leave the baby in the car and leave the car unlocked? Is that literally not in the what not to do as a parent manual? Isn't that on the first page, people? The case got barely any press, and the parents also moved city. The kid could very much still be alive, and the police theorized maybe a barren woman could have seen the crying baby and taken her thinking she was saving her. Another version of the story involves a witness claiming they saw a man carrying a crying baby onto the bus around the time of the disappearance. My dear Harpreet Paul, wherever did you end up? At number 4 is Ronald Lee Stoecker. In May of 1996, 15-year-old Jean Marie Humble ran away from Peoria's Children's Home Academy, which was a place for troubled kids. As she was walking with no plan, she was offered a ride from Ronald and accepted. And yes, he was a stranger, but she was also extremely desperate to get away. He drove miles into the country to this abandoned farm shed and brought her inside. There, he raped her with a knife, beat her, choked her, and slashed her across the throat and left her for dead. But she wasn't. Superwoman Jean managed to walk a mile to the nearest house to ask for help. Ronald and his car were nowhere to be found by the time authorities ended up getting to Jean. She ended up dying from her injuries a month later, and Ronald was found a year later in Costa Rica, where he had fled. He was sentenced to life in prison for the murder and 30 years on top of that for the sexual assault. And honestly, he probably deserved more than that, I'm not gonna lie to you. Filling at number 3 star is Edward Fonda III. Now, Edward was a retired machinist that moved to Springfield Township in Pennsylvania. He was living with his daughter Mary Jane and spent most of his time fixing up the house and creating a lovely garden. In 1993, his wife died, and he at that point, quite old, needed a cane to get around. According to Mary Jane, his wife's death killed Edward on the inside, but other accounts claim that Edward and Mary Jane weren't even close, so how would she even know that? In August of that year, Mary woke up one morning and claimed she had heard her dad go to the front door. She fell back asleep for a few hours and woke up to find him still not home. She reported him missing, and it was assumed he had wandered off somewhere, but that was unlikely. Then his kids changed their story and claimed he had committed suicide, also unlikely. Then authorities started suspecting it was Mary Jane who killed her father for unknown reasons. She had no alibi for the hours she said she was asleep, and then her story started changing. Mary then claimed she was on a lot of medication at the time and could have done something she doesn't remember. An X was also weirdly marked on her calendar for that day at 8 AM. Was it premeditated? No one has been able to figure it out, and no one will. Now, at number 2 is Cartierville John Doe. On the 1st of March 1991, a body was found in the Cartierville suburb of Montreal. The man was around 30 to 50 years old and was found in a box wrapped in garbage bags. The box was disposed of in the city dump, but it was a trail of blood that led someone to find the box. It had been snowing quite a bit, but the box wasn't that fat covered, meaning it hadn't been there for that long. When authorities finally examined the body, they were horrified. The man had been stabbed to death 127 times all over his body, and I mean all over. His face, his genitals, his eyeballs, everywhere. His hands had also been cut off, and the extent of his wounds made him virtually impossible to identify. Investigators believe it was a crime of passion, but there's just no way. I refuse to believe that. I get hell hath no fury like a woman scorned, but come on, what could this guy have done to his partner for them to go and do that? Really? And finally, at number 1 is LEAH ULBRICH, October 29th, 1995. 24-year-old LEAH ULBRICH was dragged to death by a speeding car for 4 painful miles. The route went from the South Meadows of Hartford to Goodwin Park in Wethersfield. Officials believe it's still the largest crime scene ever recorded, and I can't even think of the gore that was left along the route. Officers said they found a trail of thick blood as well as pieces of her body and clothing. Apparently, a witness saw her in an argument with someone in a Nissan Altima that morning at 5 a.m. What happened next is very convoluted. Either she tried to get out of the car herself, or she was pushed out with her arms still trapped in the seatbelt. A newspaper delivery driver saw the car with LEAH struggling attached to it and tried following it, but it sped away from him. She was so torn apart by the end of it that officers identified her solely by her tattoos. LEAH had lived a very troubled life until then. She had been married with 2 kids who had been taken off her due to her drug problem. The route where she had an argument was also known to be an area populated with sex workers. And in the 90s and even now, sex workers usually go missing or are killed and no one is looking for them. It is a huge problem. And that is it for today's video, guys. I honestly loved this video. Let us know if you want us to do like a series of like true scary stories from the 70s, 80s, 2000s, 2010s. I feel like it would be quite fun to do. As always, I'm your host, Eamon Hassan, and I'll catch you in the next one. Bye!